presentation piece will last more than a half-hour tops, you have the opportunity, I believe, through a chat box all the way on the right. Type any questions at any point that you want us to talk about. If you have anything that you're wondering about, or something that maybe you've had a challenge as an advisor. I know something else that Troy is going to do at some point is he has a poll that he's going to run at some point to get a better idea as to who is on this on the webinar. And we're wondering how many of you maybe have not yet advised, how many of you are first-time advisors maybe this year, how many of you have been advising maybe for a year or two already, and then, of course, who the veterans in the room are, or on the webinar. So without further ado, Troy, you can do that at any point, but let's go ahead to the next slide where I'm just going to share what I'm hoping we all accomplish today. So of course, we all understand and respect learning outcomes. I want us to talk a little bit about the differences and similarities of advising and supervision, because that's the fundamentals of advising, is what makes it different, but what makes it similar. We are going to spend a little bit of time talking about common first-time advisor challenges, and then, of course, how do all these great things like building rapport, building relationships with our students, managing conflicts, engaging them in decision-making, how does that tie into advising? And of course, being the year 2014, the last many years, risk management and legal policies have really helped shape the role of an advisor. And finally, what professional development opportunities exist for advising? So I'm going to give really a Cliff Notes version of all of this to you all, as I think what my favorite part of these webinars and virtual roundtables really comes down to is what are the questions that you have. So again, at any point, feel free to type a question in the chat bar on the right, and it will go directly to Troy, and he'll read some of those questions to us later. So without further ado, Troy, did you want to do the poll now to get a better idea as to who's here?
Sounds great. I'll launch it now.
Excellent. So if you can all just take a moment and just check one of the boxes. It's a very easy poll. But how many years of advising do you have, experience of advising? Again, is this something that you're excited to do in the future but haven't yet ever done? Are you in your first year as an advisor, 1 to 2 years, or 3 or more years? So we'll give you about 20 to 30 seconds to check one of those boxes. And really, there's no right or wrong answers. You know how much experience you have. Right, and Troy, I don't know if you can tell how many people have actually voted.
We have 87% as of now have voted.
Excellent. So last call, check one of the boxes if you can, and otherwise Troy's going to close it up in about 5 seconds, and we'll all see who is on this call.
Closing now.
Right.
So we're looking at 0% do not have any advising experience, 8% are in their first year, 54% 1 to 2 years, 46% for 3 years or more. Excellent.
So that shows that we really don't need to define advising too much from the start, as you all know what advising means to you. Now, you might all have different definitions based on your experiences and the training you received. So let's go ahead to the next slide here. And I always love to show some pictures just to get you excited. These are just some examples of things that got me excited about advising over the years. To give you a little bit more about my own background, during the last, probably the last 15, 16 years, I've advised campus-wide organizations, area-wide organizations, and hall government organizations as well. And some of the photos that you see are just some highlights from over the years of working with the Residence Hall Association at Arizona State University. But having the opportunity to have worked with cultural organizations as well as non-residential life organizations too. I know all of you have your own mental images of the highlights you've had over the year or years. 8% of you, this is your first year, and hopefully you're excited enough to want to come to a webinar about advising so that you can get even more insight moving into maybe year number 2 next year. Same thing for those of you who've done this for a couple of years, great. something makes you want to come back year after year. And for the 46% of you that I would call experts or veterans in the world of advising, obviously you could probably be giving this webinar as well in the future. So again, these are just a few snapshots into the highlights from my working with one of the largest RHAs in the country at ASU. So moving forward to this next slide here, what is advising? And this is where usually at a program presentation we'd have a great dialogue about it. But sometimes, and we can, you can click the button, and I'm saying that to Troy. Sometimes it's not so much just what is advising, but what is it not? And many of us supervise student staff. Many of us, well, all of you, it sounds like, advise a group of student leaders. There are clearly some similarities and some differences when it comes to the world of advising. The difference that you make, the challenge and support that you give them, or that you help really set them up for success, giving the tools that these students need to succeed. It's very different than the accountability that goes along with supervising. Obviously, if you're a supervisor, you have a responsibility to make sure that the student staff are doing their jobs and they're accomplishing what they're setting out to do. Advising doesn't always work that way, as we all know all too well. We have seen our students succeed, and we've seen our students fail, and we've seen them get right back up, have a good conversation about what we could do differently, and then succeed the next time. Those are some of the best things about advising, is you really can help them grow in a very different way than the traditional supervision role, which again, there's nothing wrong with. I think having the opportunity as a professional to work with as a supervisor and as an advisor helps all of you become even better, more well-rounded professionals. And hopefully your students, whether they're your RAs and CAs that you're supervising or the Hall government and RHA and NRHH leaders you're advising, hopefully they see what you're doing, and many of them might even want to follow in your footsteps and enter student affairs. I'm guessing if we did a different poll, and no, Troy, we don't need to do this one, but I'm curious if we asked how many of you actually started out in an organization where you were being advised by a professional of higher ed, I bet a lot of you would probably say yes to that. So again, what is advising? Really, it is many different things that you all probably know all too well, but it is that opportunity to help a student grow and have the ability to fall while they're en route to really succeeding. So I have some quotes later that we'll share before we wrap up from some other professionals, but for the moment I just wanted to highlight that advising does mean something different to all of us. As we move on to the next slide, a number of you, I'm guessing, probably have seen this book, and there's a new edition that's going to be coming out in the near future, Advice for Advisors. I know how we get all very excited when we learn that there's a textbook out there for something as fun as being a housing professional. Well, this book is subtitled Empowering Your Residence Hall Association. So between Norb Dunkel and Cindy Spencer, they have done so much research on the topic of being an advisor of RHAs, but they also have found a great group of professionals across the country, across North America, to really highlight their experiences. And first-time advisor challenges is one of the first topics. And I want to highlight that in this book, they actually bring up 4 examples of very common advisor challenges. One is just creating a sense of balance. I always remember my first year as an RHA advisor. I worked with all the Hall government, all the Hall council advisors, and I had some first-time advisors who really didn't know that it was okay to tell a student leader that at 2 in the morning is probably not the best time for them to go hunt them down for a signature on an expenditure request form. So that's something that could wait till the next business day if we're talking about the middle of the night. But advisors might not know that that's something that you have the right to create a sense of balance, and you really need to for your own well-being. Because unlike supervision, which could be all around the clock, advising is. You're an advisor night, day, weekend, it doesn't matter. You're on a trip, you might get a text from one of your advisees. You need to know how to create that sense of balance, as that will set you and the students up for success, especially if you talk about that at the beginning of the year. I'm guessing if we did another poll, a number of you would say this is an area you're still working on. But at the same point, you really do need to find what works for you, which is going to be different for everyone. In fact, all of these things that we're discussing about advising is different for all of us because we all have different styles. The second challenge is professional student advocacy. Many of us, again, as students, we're great at advocating for other students. But how do you do it now that you're a professional? Can you still advocate in the same kind of way? Maybe to some extent, but for the most part, no. At this point, you are the professional. You are the advisor. What you need to do is give them the tools they need as students to advocate for one another. And yes, when it comes to professional associations, when it comes to your department, you definitely advocate for those students and the organization. But it looks very different when you're at an RHA or an NRHH or a hall government meeting, what level of advocacy you do right then and there or what you're promoting. And Troy, at any point, you're welcome to jump in if there's something that you're getting a message about that we need to add, talk more about. Advisor versus a friend. This is kind of a big one. Sometimes we have advisors, maybe even some of you on this call, might still be undergraduates. Or maybe you graduated in the last year or two. Or maybe you're at least within the same age range of some of the students that you advise. If that's the case, it's very hard to hard to distinguish between being that advisor and being that friend. Can you be both? Should you be one or the other? Really, it's different based on your style. But that is something that a lot of advisors have quoted to being a big challenge before. What does that mean to be a friend? Can you still be friendly while not necessarily being best friends with all these students you advise? Why, absolutely. But again, what does that look like, and what are those expectations you set out at the beginning of the year? Not only expectations you have of the students, but more importantly, what is your role as an advisor for them? Have them tell you what they're looking for, and sometimes there's some great resources and worksheets out there to prepare you, and one of those is even in the book Advice for Advisors, which is still available through AIMHO. Oh, I see we're going back and forth. So yes, how do you find that balance between being an advisor and a friend? Should they be calling you all night long or coming to your office hours to sit down and have you be their personal counselor? I'm pretty sure you're not getting paid to be a counselor. But at the same point, there is that balance of talking about whatever can help support them as a person during one-on-ones and having them see you as their best friend in life. So make sure you have that differentiation. And finally, advising versus participating. When many of us have first start as advisors and we were that involved in an organization, I know for me, I forgot to mention I'm the IACRA Regional Advisor currently, and I know some of you are campus advisors that I already work with, but I was very involved in IACRA as an undergraduate student as well. So going from participating to showing up to my first conference as an advisor, it was hard for me not to want to overly participate. Same thing working as an RHA advisor. After that was once upon a time my favorite organization to be a part of as an undergrad on my campus. So you need to find that difference between being the advisor and being the person that once upon a time participated. If you have great ideas of how to help the organization along to the next level, to that next place, by all means, you can bring it up in whatever way you feel is appropriate, but you shouldn't be the one calling the shots. You shouldn't be the one telling everyone how they should run the organization. You are their advisor. They're the ones who are really making that decision of where to go next. Now, can you influence them based on maybe they don't really have all the tools to succeed? Of course you can give them whatever they need to get there, but you shouldn't be making those decisions. You shouldn't be participating the same way the students are. But again, all of these 4 areas are different based on your own experiences and your own style. So let's move on to the next slide. And again, this is hard for me just to talk, because I would love there to be a dialogue.
So
if there are certain things that oh, please.
In that kind of idea of dialogue, the participants, if you want to ask Cory any questions or kind of engage in this dialogue, you can type in your questions to where you responded that you were here and that you could hear me. So that way I could tell Cory your questions. So if there's any questions right now, I'd love to kind of hear from you all. and we can ask Cory from there. So go ahead and send them away if you have them.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Yes, please.
Okay.
So this is just a review from your student development theory classes over the years. Bruce Tuckman, back in 1965, a fellow Buckeye, had developed this, I say Dr. Seuss style because the 5 stages, once upon a time 4 stages of group development, they rhyme. Forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning. This ties directly in the world of just helping our students succeed as a team. Often we have some of the best, most talented student leaders that each individually can do their job so well, but when they don't click with the others, that makes it very difficult for us to really advise them and help them grow as an organization. Yes, they at the beginning of the year will form their organization and do those icebreakers, figure out maybe who likes what kind of candy and what makes each of them tick. But at some point, they may go through that storming phase. It says vying for leadership. Well, yeah, there will be the trials and tribulations of getting to know each other when all of a sudden maybe they become a little too close. But at some point, they will figure out that they just need to move forward, and maybe through your help as an advisor, they'll get to that norming phase where they finally have that consensus moving forward. What will it take to succeed as an organization and as a group of leaders? And at some point, may you all be fortunate enough to have a performing group that really accomplishes everything it sets out and more. And then, of course, adjourning, which is pretty much unforming the group and wrapping up one year, maybe setting up the next year and transitioning into a new group. So I mentioned this just as one example that there are so many different, not only theories, but different aspects of what we already do with our student staff that we supervise and our peers that we work with. I mentioned before that I really want us to learn how all these different areas tie into advising. Again, knowing that all of you are at least in your first year as an advisor currently, this is nothing new to you. But I do want you to recognize that these stages of group development are probably one of the most key pieces to advising a group of student leaders, regardless of how good or qualified they are for whatever positions individually they may be in. So I think it's pretty clear-cut how that ties into advising. So yeah, let's move to the next slide, but I actually do have the first question here, and I'd like to thank Nick for it. Again, we were talking about those 4, in fact, maybe Troy, you can go back 2 slides. We were talking about those 4 challenges everyone's gone through, and I know the professional student advocacy can be a little bit confusing. It is listed in the book as a specific example. One thing may be, and I'm trying to think of a specific example, maybe that ASU that we've gone through before. We have, when we advocate for our students, when students advocate for students, maybe they advocate with room and board rates. And maybe maybe our director of housing or dining comes to RHA one year, which is something we do at all 4 of our campuses with RHA. They have the opportunity as students to make their recommendations for room and board rates for the next year. Now, we have our opinions. We know that higher percentages will probably lead to bigger budgets for us for housing in general. And who knows, maybe someday increase salary, a raise or something, and many other great things. Now, at the same point, we also recognize that sometimes low percentages might be more affordable for our students. Regardless of what we think, or if we want to advocate for those lower percentages, I think in the past I've tried to be very hands-off when it came to that dialogue. Now, I would ask questions to get them thinking. I would really, I would challenge them to say, you do realize what this means for RHA, a 0% increase versus a 3% increase versus a 10% increase. But that's a difference between challenging someone and really being a student advocate as a professional. You don't want to say, well, I think you should all go for the 0% because that's what will be best for you and your finances. On the flip side, later, regardless of what they then make that recommendation, you have an obligation as their advisor to then bring that and advocate maybe to your supervisor or your director, but you want to be careful that you're not overstepping and advocating for what they want to them to the point it's going to influence them all and really compromise your role as a professional at the same point. So I don't know if that is, if Nick, that's the direction you were wanting as far as an example, but professional student advocacy is something that you all do whether you realize it or not. But I'm guessing depending on what your relationship with your supervisor and if they even know everything you're doing as an advisor, that may be something that you're encouraged to do in one way or the other. So, and I think that example also gave you an idea of what you don't want to necessarily do as well. So, all right. Thanks, Nick. So let's move 2 slides forward. Now, risk management, and again, I appreciate you just listening, but please do send those notes, just like Nick did moments ago. Any of you can type anything in, and Troy will get that almost instantaneously. So let's talk about risk management. There used to be so much great advising programs that happened in the late 90s and even earlier than that. And we'll talk a little bit more about the ART program a little bit later. It's the Advisor Resource Training through NCUR. That was created in 1996. And Norb Dunkel, who's one of the 2 co-authors of the book you just saw, conducted a lot of great research. Since then, there's been off and on research in the last, I don't know, 20 years, give or take, 15 years, and my own dissertation work was on this topic. Risk management's one area that really didn't exist to the same extent that it does now. But now, everything is about risks. How do we manage risks? We have an advisor manual within our Student Organization Resource Center at ASU that this slide that you see here also I have to give some credit to Texas A&M University and their work with student organizations. Risk management, this PREFS guide, and there's some great documents on this. There are a lot of risks out there. Physical risks. Obviously, we know what that means because we try to be very intentional that we're not going to put our students in a physical risk at any point in time, or anyone into a physical risk, and that goes well beyond advising. But once we get to reputational risks, that starts to look a little different for the world of advising. Oh, and by the way, physical risks may be anything from you taking a group of students somewhere where they could get injured. Even something, and that's just one example, but I know we used to take turnaround trips over to Six Flags in California or to even Disneyland. Well, knowing there are all those roller coasters there, there's always that possibility of physical risk there. But what about when we have those inflatable games on our own campus? And those of you who've ever been at maybe the early days of ARLIC, the Arizona Residential Leadership Conference, may remember stories that I've told about some of those inflatable games and students who may have gotten injured in some of those. Those are physical risks. Reputational risks, on the other hand, they're representing our students represent our organization, which represents our university. You might go to a conference like IACUR or ARLIC or some other great opportunity to show off your school, but wherever you're going, you represent your university, your college, your organization. I'm not worried about you as an advisor, but I might be a little worried about certain students that are chosen to be on a delegation. And so you have to have some very intentional conversations about what it means to put your reputation at risk based on who these students are. 99%, or hopefully 99% of the time, our students were carefully selected, prepared for this conference experience, and they meet with student leaders and or advisors throughout that whole experience. That's great. But what happens when they go to a student leadership conference and they do get caught with alcohol or marijuana, or they're making fun of their rival school and saying some very inappropriate things, or many worse things than I've even mentioned? Those can all be reputational risks. Emotional risks, I'm going to keep this one pretty simple, but anytime that you think that your students' emotions may be at risk, here's an example. Going on a turnaround trip, you might have some international students there, and they don't have any friends that are on the trip. Maybe they're the only one who went on the trip because they heard, please get involved when you go to the United States. That's happened a number of times on some of the turnaround trips that my housing department has done. So what are we doing to introduce students to other students? And even non-international students. You might have a random student who just wants to go have a good time, but they don't know anyone. Or what happens if they're traveling somewhere and they absolutely are scared to death of flying, but NACUR conference is in Wisconsin and we're traveling from Arizona. So I think there's a number of different kind of risks. You as an advisor need to know the students you're working with, what will cause anyone to really feel nervous or anxious about something. Let's eliminate those risks to the best of our ability. Financial risks, obviously, you don't want to take risks with money if you can help it. If you're hosting I know once upon a time years ago, one of the groups that I had worked with, we had put together a big event at the beginning of the year, and the planners of the event wanted to fly in some professionals that would be the band, which would then perform for free. Well, that might save a lot of money, but what happens if they didn't get on that flight, and then they're not going to even show up? And there were some financial risks involved there, so we had to take some very extra precautions to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in those kind of situations. Facilities risks, whether we're talking ADA, whether we're talking just having an obstacle course prepared where maybe it wouldn't be a very safe place to be, and that goes into facilities as well. Facilities and physical risk can tie directly into one another. And sustainability risks really just, that could also be financial. It's, are you being unsustainable to the point that we're spending all this money on something, or we're just, maybe we have a big event like homecoming and throw out all of the materials afterwards. We're talking about maybe hundreds of hours of work and quite a bit of money of resources, and all of a sudden you throw it away. That's what we used to do at one point for homecoming. So that's risk management. I'm done talking about that at the moment, but you can ask a lot of questions about it if you wish. That's just an example of things you need to keep in mind as an advisor. Let's move to the next slide. We're just very briefly, I just want you to see on the screen in front of you are just a couple of advising topics that exist there. Some of these have to do directly with some trainings that may be out there, like art. Others are just topics that maybe I presented on, or maybe you presented on, depending on who's on the call. But these are all things you should be keeping in mind. How does advising tie into retention and recruitment of student leaders? How can you create more inclusive organizations from an advisor perspective, or hold student leaders accountable? Or what role do you have of encouraging our students to use technology and social media to further our organization's missions? So these are all topics that I encourage you, if you want to ask any questions about any of them, go right ahead. But my hope is that you can, at any point in time, if you want some further opportunities, we'll talk about art again in a second, but you should talk to your supervisors. You should talk about the importance of advising at conferences. I know that at both AIMHO conferences and at AIMHO Hawaii, I was having a conversation with my colleague Jen O'Brien, who might even be on the call, I believe, about how both of us were probably two of the very few people who even were putting on advising-related topics at conferences, and we both were from the same institution. So we need to have advisors really putting on more sessions and putting more proposals together when you go to regional conferences, when you go to international conferences like AIMHO Hawaii or NASPA or ACPA. On the other hand, we know that NACUR conferences and our student conferences have a lot of great opportunities for advisors. And with that in mind, let's move one more slide down.
So I have a question for you, Cory.
Oh, please, yes, jump right on in.
So the RHA, this is from Allison. She says, the RHA advice is largely made up of first and second year students. I find it difficult to advise these students and not be too involved. I find they typically need a lot more advising because there aren't many students coming back year after year, since most of our students move off campus after their first or second year. Do you have any advice on how to not be too involved advising students new to the organization?
Absolutely, and a lot of our schools, whether it's in our AIMHO region or some of the other regions, are two-year institutions. So while many of our schools really attract mainly freshmen and sophomore students, other schools don't have an option. Other schools only have 2 years as a junior college or a community college, depending on the state. So with that in mind, you do have to build those connections right away, and sometimes maybe it's as early as orientation, really selling your experience at orientation, which I think probably most of us already do. But there's also value in having sometimes it feels like you spend so much time and effort to get them to the point where they're already great student leaders, but then they either graduate or they move off campus. So how can you tap some of those student leaders to help develop other students? How do you get those freshmen from the beginning of their freshman year to be able to speed through the process of learning, and maybe you get past the forming stage and maybe the storming stage real quickly and jump right into a norming stage. So I think that you can do a lot of that, and you can do it from an advisor perspective, but you need to set them up for success. Allison, it's a great question because you don't want to run the organization because it's theirs, but you have a lot of influence in what that looks like and how students run the organization. So I think you have to be very intentional. How do you sell that experience to really motivate freshmen to step in right from day one? How do you not waste time to really develop them as leaders? And if you do all of that in the first couple weeks in an effective enough way, you shouldn't have to worry about that too much as time progresses. And if you can create through really moving along the involvement of student leaders, who's to say if you're at a 4-year institution, that's not in turn going to also lead to better retention numbers, that you do have more sophomores and juniors and seniors living on. But for those of you at 2-year institutions, you don't really have much choice. You only have 2 years to work with them, and unfortunately every year you're going to have to recreate, in a sense, recreate the wheel with a new group of leaders. But how can you have those sophomores or those second-year students help form that transition for that next group of leaders to come in and take over? So I don't really have the end-all, be-all answer there, but I think one of the great things about advisors is many of us have the same experiences, many of us are in the same challenges, and I would encourage you to send a note to the AIMHO listserv, or if you're not in our region, to your own respective listserv. That's also a reason why the IACUR region has an advisor listserv. Take advantage of picking the brain of others who are in exactly the same boat as you. I've been very fortunate that I haven't had to work with, well, actually it's more of a challenge. I haven't worked with 2-year institutions before, or organizations that haven't had some juniors and seniors, but it's very possible that maybe next year that's going to be the case. So I don't know if I really fully answered the question, but I hope that I at least gave you some things to think about, Allison, and everybody else who's on the call. And I would encourage you all to send notes to listservs if you have those kind of questions. As many of you, just looking at the list of the schools represented on the call today, some of you are from 2-year institutions. So thank you, Troy. If we move to the next slide, this talks a little bit about art, just so that you know what exists out there. In 1996, some research by Norb Dunkel and Diane Porter, both from the University of Florida, really put together, they figured out what the curriculums are, what were the top desired responsibilities by students for their advisors, and by advisors for their own roles. And in comparing those lists of the top 10 lists of what advisors should be focusing their time and attention in 1996 on, a whole program track, a curriculum was developed. We were giving out certificates for many years. It was never a certification program, but it was a certificate that would look good on your resume to show that, yes, you know the basics of advising. AIMHO and NACUR, as international associations, adopted art unofficially and even added a more advanced track called Master Art in 2003. And these workshops were offered at state, regional, and national conferences. And later, it started happening through day-long workshops, drive-ins, Maybe someone went through art and then took it back to their own campus. And it consisted of 5 core workshops, 7 electives, and 3 experiential components. Well, in 2012, NACUR, as an international association now, adopted ART officially, changed the name from the Advisor Recognition and Training Program to the Advisor Resource Training. And now there's a 3-level training that's going to be introduced in NACUR this year in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I know some of you will likely be there for this, where the first level really is geared towards your campus level. The second level is more meant for campus-wide advisors instead of just maybe a hall advisor. And that's going to be done only at regional and NACUR conferences. And then the third level is that master track that really is meant more for probably those of you aspiring for regional advisor roles or beyond. But of course, that second and third level, anyone's welcome to go through those trainings, which will only take place at those conferences. That level 1 is meant to be done on a college campus or university campus. So many of you will be experiencing that first level over the course of this next year once it's unveiled at NACUR. And some of you on the call have also been involved with developing that curriculum too. So I just want you to know there are training programs out there. I'm going to share my contact information a little bit later, and if you're part of AIMHO and IACUR and you wish, you're welcome to outreach to me and I can connect you more with some art resources. If you're coming from another region, please contact your own regional advisors or outreach to me if you don't know who they are, and I can put you in touch with them. Even though I know some of you actually were told about this webinar from your regional advisors, so you should know who they are already. And in the region of AIMHO, if you are in Nevada, that is part of NACUR on the Pacific versus our Intermountain region. So it's a little bit different over for us. But I'm happy to be a resource for all of you. Let's move to the next slide because I think we're getting very close to my favorite part. I want to share with you, again, I mentioned about Norb and Cindy, the authors of Advice for Advisors. Norb Dunkel said at one point, advising is one of the most truly rewarding experiences for residence life staff. Interacting with students, watching the development and witnessing the camaraderie of the residence hall organization provides benefits that go far beyond a paycheck. We know that's true, but I did want to point that out, that it's something I should reiterate because advising makes our roles so rewarding. And Cindy said, very simply, to advise is to touch life forevermore. So yes, you may be impacting students in ways that you probably won't in the same way if you're their supervisor. So I want, at this point, I don't know, I want to give you a moment, and I'll be quiet for a moment, to really just let you type those questions in. And when you have some, when you send them on in, this is the interactive part. Even if you're a pro and you're part of that 46% on the call that have been doing this for more than 3 years, or 3 or more years, if there's something that you think would be helpful for us to dialogue about, go ahead and type in your recommendations, your suggestions, not only for topics, but if you have advice for those other advisors on the call, type it in. And Troy, by all means, when you get them, feel free to start reading them off. Did I say this is like my favorite part of the call? Maybe.
Nothing yet.
All right. So, and again, we are only just over a month away from NACUR's conference in Eau Claire. So we recognize that not everyone who is an advisor necessarily gets the opportunity to go to regional and NACUR conferences, but there are a lot of other opportunities, whether it is a trip to a state conference. Again, we have ARLIC in Arizona, and we know that, I think it was Colorado and Wyoming that were starting something. We know that we have RAPIN for student staff in our region, and other regions have something very similar for their RAs and community assistants. You might have turnaround trips. There are a lot of opportunities for you to travel with groups or to even become an advisor on your own campus for something that would involve you going to a conference. But in the meanwhile, even on your own campuses, you have a lot of, it sounds like you all already advise, which is great.
So a question from Anna Marie. Is
Excellent.
NCUR an organization that you have to pay a fee to be a part of?
So yes, there are some dues depending on the size of the institution. And NCUR is N-A-C-U-R-H. So NCUR.org, NCUR.com, I think all get you to the same website. So we ask schools to affiliate, and you're automatically then also part of the regional association once you're a member of NCUR. And the regional associations might be IACUR or PCUR. There's only 8 of them. But we also have representation from international members that are embedded into our regions too. So yes,
So
you're asked
are there any fees for individual members?
So
Just
for any school, the only fee that exists right now is the school will pay a fee to NCUR. They're the dues that also go along with a couple of other expectations, like, do you have a constitution for your organization? Do you have an RHA? Do you have an NRHH? Answering those questions, paying that fee, but then also they ask you to submit one resource files index submission, and that might be just highlighting a program that it's an opportunity for you to show off your institution, and usually students will complete that for us. Now, on the flip side, there are always opportunities through IACUR, through NCUR, through the regional associations, that if you've never been a part of NCUR before, you can get that waived, and there's some different ways to do that. There are also different scholarships that can cover the cost of a school, maybe a first-time attendee, attending NCUR or other conferences. We also know that on-campus marketing is one of the many great companies that we have used through AIMHO and at our corporate partner fair each year. They actually sponsor the cost of the first year that you use them. They'll pay your dues for NCUR, I believe. So there are different opportunities there where you're not always, if money is an issue, it shouldn't hold you back from joining NCUR. On the other hand, if you have students that aren't going to follow through with actively utilizing the resources and showing off all the great things you do on your own campus, it might not make sense to join as of yet. But if you're within the AIMHO and IACUR region and you're interested in NCUR, contact me directly, and I'll put you in touch with the student leader who works specifically with recruitment and retention. So these are great questions.
Next question is, when students struggle with deadlines and administrative areas, what advice do you have to ensure advising versus participating?
Okay, can you repeat that one more time, please, Troy?
When students struggle with deadlines and administrative areas, what advice do you have to ensure advising versus participating?
Yes, and that also depends on your institution. There's some schools that, depending on what it is that they need to work on administratively, you might have to help them out with some of that paperwork. On the other hand, what I always found was very helpful is that very first time we sat down, maybe the first time either I did it with them watching, and then the second time maybe they did it and I would watch, and the third time I just knew it was getting done. But it really is up to each individual, and everyone has their own styles as student leaders too, not just advisors. But at the end of the day, you need to get to the point that you transition somebody else into that role so you're not doing it. And honestly, I would recommend right off the bat, never do their work for them. But you also need to make it clear right when they step into the role that that's part of their role. They need to make sure that they're staying on top of requests for funding or monthly updates or showing up to one-on-ones in a timely manner. And one of the things I've learned is if you have an RHA or a hall government and it's not the president who's having the issues, you need to probably incorporate the president into helping resolve this. You're not their supervisor again, but they have a supervisor. I know RHA at ASU, we often had our executive director, which is just a fancy name for a president. We would have that individual follow up with any of the executives that were struggling with administratively getting whatever they need done. So I think that was great. But at the same time, you as an advisor can still give them a reminder to fill out this form or to show up to a meeting if you think that will help them succeed. So I think participating, you still don't need to ever fill everything out, But you holding them accountable, which is a whole thing we didn't even discuss today, you can still hold a student leader accountable, but you're doing it in a very different way, and often you're doing it through a general reminder or a conversation or a, hey, I'd love to give you some feedback to help you be even better at your role in the future. I think that's something that looks very different for supervision and advising, but you still can hold them accountable, and I wouldn't call that participating. I would call that being an advisor. Thank you. A great question. Other questions that are out there?
I just sent one to you.
Oh, great. So the question that Troy just sent, and I have to open it up to see the whole question. It cut off on my phone. Troy is using every medium to communicate with me, whether it's texting or talking out loud or the chat box here. The question is whether there are any trainings provided on campuses that help advisors serve student organizations better. One of you had mentioned we have many faculty members who are not the greatest of advisors, and we in student affairs tend to work more closely and are more engaged with those student groups. What can we do to help other advisors better serve the organizations we don't directly with? So I want to make it very clear that when we talk about advising, we're not talking about academic advising. We're talking about student organization advising. But often faculty members are advisors of student groups. And if that's the case, I know that while we used the art program on the ASU campus, or ASU as a university on our 4 campuses, we also recognize that there are other trainings that often the student activities or student engagement offices or the student union offices put on. We know that we started off the year, some of us may be lucky enough to have a 1 or 2 hour session where we have all of our advisors go through an advising 101, especially if you're at a large enough institution to have a full-scale training in the summer. On the other hand, who's to say you couldn't request it to be longer and more in-depth? So at ASU, for instance, we went from a 2-hour training my first year as an advisor to a full day-long training to pretty much a day and a half of training down the road. That might not always be realistic, but that obviously shows what the emphasis on advising may be for one school or another. But the question, are there other trainings that are provided on campuses? That really is up to each individual campus. And I know that I've talked to my colleagues who work in other areas of student affairs. It's usually going to be student affairs and not academic affairs that will have the how to be the best advisor sessions. But I definitely encourage you to talk to your student engagement or student involvement staff on your own campus. Another question that came up is, what advice do I have or do we have for redirecting students when they believe you are more of a friend to them instead of an advisor? And that is a great question. That goes back to those initial challenges at the beginning. And yeah, it really is, how do you communicate it? There's 2 ways I recommend you do it. One way is the proactive beginning of the year, beat this issue by talking about what your relationship will look like with them before it ever happens. But unfortunately, many of us, especially at this time of the year, you have students that you've been working with all year that just think you're such a good friend, and you need to maybe curb that a bit. At that point, you need to have a heart-to-heart with them. You don't need to say, hey, I'm not your friend. You just need to say, I'd like to remind you, well, I will gladly be there for you in any way I can. At the same time, please remember that I am still your advisor. And I think that's very helpful for you to remind them of, and maybe to revisit expectations and roles periodically. In fact, I used to always do it at least twice a year, once at the beginning of the year, once at the beginning of the next semester. So I think that conversation is very key to helping a student understand that you shouldn't be more of a friend of them than an advisor. Yes, there's the overlapping tendencies of friendship and advising, but at the same point, you need to make that very clear that you are still their advisor. Now, what advice for in a dialogue when you notice a student has begun to seek you and place you in a counseling role and has overshared with you? That kind of goes along with the last one as well. I do love the fact that student affairs often could be mistaken for counseling, and many of us have taken counseling classes. But that doesn't mean that you're supposed to be a counselor. And I think by all means, if they overshare with you, some of us think that sharing about relationships, sharing about their future goals might be oversharing. Others, those are questions you might even ask them about. That's a style thing. It's between you and them. But if they get to the point that you need to be bringing in a professional, if they start talking about suicidal ideations, they start talking about mental health issues, maybe an eating disorder, maybe the fact that they're sitting, maybe laying down on your sofa pretending you're a therapist. Some of them really do that, and in all those cases, you really do need to talk about what that boundary is, saying, yes, you're welcome to share that with me, but I'm not a counseling expert. Rather, I'd like to set up a time for you to maybe meet one of my colleagues who works in counseling, and that's perfectly fine. You've been doing that all along to me. I'd like to introduce you to them. I'll even go over with you for the first session. So like things like that, but it's those conversations, the communication, that's going to be key. Do you have other suggestions for resources and books for graduate or first-time professional advisors? Absolutely. While I know they don't focus on advising too often, stay in touch with like the Talking Stick and the AIMHO organization books that they actually publish. They have a great library. Advice for Advisors is one book. They even have an entire book about the Myers-Briggs and how it applies to the role of a resident assistant. So a lot of these books will have different areas tapping into advising, but they're not necessarily just advising focused. I think you'll also find there's some great books in the student activities world. Let's see, John Shu and Nor Bunkel actually co-advised a book about advising student organizations in general, which I use quite a bit for my dissertation research. Or if you really want, you could even read my dissertation. It's not that long compared to its action research, so it's still only about 100 pages. But on the flip side, there are some great organization, even through programming and through student activities and student involvement, there's some amazing even free subscriptions for some monthly periodicals or through different magazines that come out. So if you go to any conferences, keep your eyes and ears open for some of those. But I also recommend that if you go to, I believe, I need to double check that it's still on the IACUR there was an IACUR advisor page at one point that listed some of those professional development opportunities. So if you're interested, please do send me a note and I can find you some more additional reading material. I haven't memorized all the great stuff out there, but there are great things, great reads. And I know that AIMHO as an association has done a great job having some of our advisors trying to get that Master Arts completed. Many of you have even written articles for our AIMHO angle as well. So great question. Troy, can you elaborate? You just said talking about student organizations. I don't know what that meant.
That was from an earlier question.
Oh, okay.
Just got it, but I think you touched on it, but Amy was asking more specifically about student org advising when you talked about faculty members, greatest advisors, or trainings on campuses type thing.
Okay, absolutely. So it was talking about student organizations. Excellent. So I know we're running short on time. Were there any other questions, Troy, that came out before I do a little wrap-up?
No, there wasn't. I just was going to do my little wrap-ups too, so I'll let you wrap up first, and we'll go from there.
Okay, sounds good. And Jeff and my friends in Montana, thanks for the thumbs-up picture. That was cool. So if you go to the next slide, I listed my own contact information with a fun picture of me. Yay. So by all means, send me an email at any point. Feel free to give me a call. You can follow me on Twitter, even though I've only been using Twitter for AIMHO, Hawaii, and the Placement Exchange. One day I'll actually remember how to use it for my own personal life too. But for the moment, if I can help engage you with opportunities to further your own experiences, I'm hoping that maybe this was a good reminder for those of you who are part of the 46% who've done this for a number of years. For those of you, the 54% in your first 2 years, hopefully this was also just gave you a couple of other things to think about. And for those of you in the first year of advising, maybe this really did give you some direction of where you need to go as an advisor moving forward. But really, advising is all about us advisors sticking together, bouncing ideas off each other. If you're an AIMHO, you have nothing to lose to send me a note and have me help set you up to be on the IACUR advisor listserv. It's a separate one from the students, and we have the ability to discuss these kind of questions. And it's not even just me, it's other advisors, other people who are on this call right now. So I appreciate you all being on here. And I believe there might be one last slide, but I think that's the wrap-up slide. So with that said, thank you for this opportunity. It was a great opportunity to me just to talk, but also to answer some of your questions. And I look forward to seeing many of you at IACUR, at NACUR, at AIMHO, at AICU Hawaii in the future. So Troy, it's all you. Thank you.
Sounds good. So Cory, there is one last question that we can answer quickly. We would like to get an answer. It just says, how involved should an advisor be with clubs, like student clubs, improv groups, soccer, when all the students really need is just a name on a piece of paper, and go from there. So
absolutely, and that's a very easy one. These are the kind of things you just want to talk to the students to make sure you know. I've been asked to be an advisor of a group before, and all that meant was they didn't need me to go to their meetings. It had nothing to do with the residence halls in any way, but they needed somebody to kind of be a faculty advisor, and they asked me, and I ended up eventually making it to at least some of their meetings, but they always forgot to tell me when they were scheduling them. So I told them I'd like to be more involved, so they actually had me sitting in and providing advice for their first ever end-of-the-year banquet they once did. That's a funny story if you ever want to hear that for another day, but it involves being on a parking structure. But I think that you need to make sure that you ask those questions. If you want to be more involved than they want you to, have that dialogue with them. But again, what does involvement look like? When you're asked to be an advisor of a general club, they might not need anything from you outside of your signature on something. But I know I don't feel comfortable signing something if I don't know what I'm signing. So I think that really, again, goes back to that dialogue. But it's a great question.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Cory, so much for taking time out of your busy day. I know you have to get running, but we really appreciate it. And I just wanted to tell our participants on the call, if you could please just feel free to use Twitter, like we were talking about just a second ago, with the hashtag AIMHO, or our Twitter handle is @AIMHO. And so please don't be afraid to use that after the call, just to kind of continue to engage in this webinar and share what you learned for the entire AIMHO region, to kind of learn from what you learned if they couldn't be with us today. So thank you so much for participating. We will try to get this PowerPoint out to you via email, the slides in a PDF form, if that's okay with Dr. Shapiro.
Absolutely.
And we did attempt to record this webinar. Hopefully it worked. Hopefully I clicked the right button. If you could just please type in the question box what you've been doing this whole time. And I want to make sure that we get how many people were attending from each institution. So if you can just say your institution and how many people were attending from your institution, that way we can keep accurate numbers of who is joining us on the webinar. And overall, we really appreciate you taking the time to listen to us today. And if you can just be on the lookout, next month, May 21st, we're having another webinar for AIMHO region for mid-level professionals. So if you are or have mid-level professionals in your department, please be sure to share with them that the webinar will be, again, May 21st. It's a Wednesday, same time, 11 a.m. for West Coast, and then Mountain Time is 12 p.m. So thank you all again so much for your time, and we really enjoyed talking with Dr. Cory Shapiro today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great day, everyone.